Trigger. Derived from the Dutch word trekker, meaning to pull, refers to a small device that releases a spring or catch to set off a mechanism, especially in order to fire a firearm, or as a verb to cause a device to function. Modern folk of English lexicon will refer to triggers as the act of getting a surprise or additional effect when taking your life in the One Piece card game, or in other words, the personification of evil manifest. And while the historical definition of a physical trigger may not match the actual card effect of a trigger in the One Piece card game, a fun fact that you may not have known is that in the late 1600s, instead of the word trigger, people actually used the word tricker, influenced by the word trick. And so are these innately tricky effects actually good for the game? Well, in my opinion, yes, but not all of them. Now, contrary to popular belief, triggers do have a cost. When you take your life, that card will go to your hand, therefore increasing your hand size by 1. By triggering an effect, you don't actually get that card to your hand, so therefore you're technically paying 1 card to be able to get that 1 effect. While yellow is the main trigger color, every single color does have some sort of triggers. Some of them will be more unique, but a lot of triggers will be a more default basic effect based on the color identity that the card is in. Red cards, for example, can have some really explosive triggers like Red Hawk, but can also have some more simple triggers that give your leader or a character plus 1000 power for the rest of that turn. You're paying 1 card to get that plus 1000 power, so therefore you have to decide if that 1 card in your hand is more valuable than having a permanent plus 1000 power for the rest of the turn. If there's only 1 more attack left and you know how big the attack's going to be, you may not actually need that trigger. On the other hand, if the opponent's only going to be hitting you at 5000, that sort of trigger can be a godsend. But still, this traditional red trigger has very few people complaining. It's a small enough effect that can be significant in the right timings, but for the most part doesn't actually hinder the game all too much, simply providing an additional hurdle for the opponent to get over and the person who triggered out that card a little bit of a reward. Another very prominent red trigger is the triggers that KO based on power. These triggers are especially very well balanced in my opinion because of the fact that the opponent can actually play around them very well. By simply attaching a dong to one of your characters to get out of something like jet pistols range, for example, you can completely negate the threat of this trigger, making it exceptionally powerful on the one hand for the red player, but only in the event that the opponent doesn't actually play around the card, making it a very uniquely balanced trigger effect. Green also has some pretty simple triggers. While they do have some really explosive triggers like Punk Gibson that can rest a character, a lot of the triggers that green has just simply rest a 4 cost or less, for example. These kinds of triggers, again, are very easy to play around because you simply just attack with your lower cost characters first to play around this trigger, and if the opponent does trigger it out, then that is their little benefit that they get at the cost of 1 card. Blue and black are generally not very trigger heavy colors. A standard blue trigger would just be to draw 1 card, and generally these will be on cards with no counter, so it essentially just gives you 1 more chance to find a card with counter, just drawing from the right side rather than the left side. And another trigger that exists in blue is the effect to be able to bottom or bounce the opponent's characters. However, similar to the green triggers, these characters generally only target low cost characters, meaning that you can play around them in the same way, hitting with your low cost characters first. And while there aren't too many black triggers, some effects like drawing 2 and trashing 1 or KOing a 3 cost or less do exist, and these sorts of things won't always be very effective, but they will have their timings. Still, most of these effects are either not intrusive enough to actually be annoying, but are also strong enough to have some value when considering the card in terms of power budget. You may have noticed that I skipped over purple because I actually dislike the way that purple triggers work in this game. Ooh. Let's not talk about the elephant in the room quite yet. Let's first talk about purple triggers before we talk about yellow. Purple triggers, while simple, can be absolutely devastating. Being able to get 1 extra dong is extremely significant because you will know if you've played the game at all that the difference between going first and second can be very significant. Being able to get that 1 extra dong means being able to play a certain power card 1 turn earlier, and especially in purple, that's trying to ramp very quickly and very consistently. Getting a free ramp, even at the cost of 1 card from your life, is extremely powerful. How many times have you fought against blue-purple Luffy? They didn't have the ramp card that they needed, and they triggered out Is to Die For, and suddenly everything is going perfectly, or even better than perfectly, because they were able to play out things like the 5 Kasnami instead of having to actually pay that 3 dong to use It's to Die For. Purple triggers, in my opinion, are a little bit too swingy, in that if you get them in the early game, you can completely run away with the game if you're the deck that can really abuse that sort of mechanic, but they do have the trade-off of being pretty useless in the late game, meaning that when you're fighting against purple deck in the early game, you're extremely terrified of hitting them for the very small, maybe 10 to 15% chance that they may trigger out something that could automatically win the game. But in the late game, you don't have to worry about any sort of trigger. Still, the main reason why I don't like how swingy these purple triggers are is because purple isn't necessarily balanced around getting these triggers, meaning that every time that you do actually get this trigger off, it feels devastating to be on the receiving end because it doesn't feel like there is really anything that you could have done about it. The reason why I think that triggers are generally fair for the game is because innately they come out when you're losing. When the opponent's hitting your life means that they don't have to deal with your board and can go aggressive. And when they're going aggressive, you're put on a timer where you don't have that much time left to respond within this game, or else you're going to end up losing. Getting a small trigger like these green triggers triggers or the red triggers that we talked about to be able to get that little bit of extra survivability can be really, really nice, help you re-stabilize the game and get to the point where you're actually good in the game. And this is where I have to say something very controversial, and that's that I think that the 3-cost spades trigger as well as the 0-cost event, you're the one who should disappear, are actually fair. Yellow is a deck that's all about triggers, so therefore their triggers should innately be a little bit stronger. It's not like green or red don't have these sorts of triggers as well, as we've mentioned, but because they're on universally usable cards like the 0-cost event that can trash one card to become plus 3k or just a general 2k, it feels more oppressive in yellow because it's more easy to put these cards into your deck. However, because you know these cards are potentially in yellow decks, as long as you understand how yellow decks are being built, you can fairly play around these cards. You don't have to go for lethal if you think that they could have something like a Bej or a 0-cost event in life, and instead can think about if you can potentially play out the game for one turn longer. Generally, historically, what this meant was that against yellow decks, you weren't necessarily trying to race them in terms of who can push the opponent's life faster, but rather yellow used to be about who can outsurvive the other the most, and this is most prevalent when you look at something like the yellow NL leader. I think that these sorts of triggers are fair in the game because they can be played around and add extra depth to the opponent's game plan, especially if they know that you may have been manipulating your life, whether it's something like the 2-cost Seori, the yellow Katakuri leader effect, or something like the 2-cost Flame Dragon event that has become a little bit more popular in the wake of yellow Luffy. If the opponent has been manipulating their life, there's a good chance that they have these sorts of defensive triggers, so you can therefore play around them more safely and more confidently to be able to make sure that you can win despite those triggers. And that's what I think is the most important thing, is that a lot of people are just playing as if they don't have these triggers and getting angry when they do, whereas what you should be doing is when you're fighting yellow, expect these triggers to come out and understand the best that you can do to play around them. However, I don't think this applies ever when it comes to triggers that play out characters. And so to talk about my qualms with trigger characters, let's first go back to the genesis of them back in OP03, where we had things like the 4-cost Cracker, the 3-cost Perospero, and the 4-cost Smoothie that you could trash one card to then play out that card. Back then, when cards just generally weren't that strong, just being able to get a free body onto the board, even at the technical cost of 2 cards, as it's the single card as well as one more card out of your hand, was still very significant, just to get another extra attacker on the board, which was one of the big ways that you're actually able to fight with some decks like Newgate, which at the time were extremely difficult for some other yellow decks. Against these bad matchups, yellow was generally reliant on getting out these trigger characters to actually be able to reach the potential power that other decks already innately had within their kit. Fast forward a couple of sets later and we got things like Kikunosho, which was essentially a no-cost trigger. Just if the opponent had 3 or less life, the card would come out. Still, of course, you wouldn't get the card to your hand, the card would come out onto the board, but this was starting to teeter on the line of things getting a little bit too strong. It felt like there was essentially no cost because of the precedent set by things like the 3-cost Perospero and the 4-cost Cracker, and just being able to have such a powerful effect on top of that being a 4-cost 6000 with a powerful on-KO effect, meaning that the difference between getting this card out and not getting this card out felt extremely significant. Fast forward another couple of sets again, we now have triggers that come out of the blue-yellow Hancock leader. These triggers are actually free because not only do you get a free character on the board, but because of your lead effect, you draw 1 card, meaning that your hand size doesn't go down. It's as if you got the card to your hand while also being able to play a character on the board, which, mind you, can be extremely powerful. Just compare the 6-cost Shakuyaku to the 5-cost Shirahoshi, and we can start to see how significantly powerful these cards have started to become. Shakuyaku is essentially the same on-play effect with Hancock's lead effect being able to draw 3 and trash 2, while also having 5,000 power, while also having 2k, making some of these old triggers completely outclassed and feeling extremely oppressive. Now, what I really want to talk about with these trigger characters is not that it's really annoying to fight against, although that is obviously true. I think that actually trigger characters are bad for both players, the person playing the triggers and the person going against them. Now, it's no secret that Bandai has gotten much better at understanding which decks are actually going to be powerful. If you look back in the day with things like the 6-cost Queen, which actually got an alt art, and the fact that Newgate was so powerful just playing vanilla characters, we can tell that the game was just generally a let's figure it out as we go sort of endeavor back in the beginning. However, now it's very clear that they understand what they're doing, knowing what types of cards are going to make certain types of decks really powerful, as we've seen with EB being able to perfectly target decks in the exact places where they need them. However, in terms of triggers, I think that we've reached a certain point where decks that use trigger characters rely on trigger characters to actually be able to be good, and therefore the way that they've balanced this is to make decks almost entirely trigger characters. If you look at a deck like Moria or Hancock, basically half, if not more than half of the entire deck are characters that can be triggered out, or triggers that can pull out other characters from your hand, essentially giving you a similar sort of effect. Obviously, this feels really bad to go against because you don't really know when you should be hitting the opponent because you're punished for basically playing the game normally, but I actually want to argue that it feels bad for the player using the triggers as well, because if they ever don't get that trigger that they absolutely rely on playing the game, then suddenly their entire game plan may fall apart. Yellow Katakuri, for example, back in the day didn't have that many trigger characters, so he didn't feel like he he was really reliant on them, but if he were to get one, he would suddenly feel like a below average leader that would suddenly feel above average. Hancock, Moria, and Yellow Luffy, on the other hand, feel like they're actually reliant on getting these triggers, so if they don't get that trigger off of that first life, it actually feels like they're behind because it didn't get what they were expected to get. And so for this reason, unless your deck is 50 triggers, I think that it's very tricky to actually be able to balance this, because it's going to feel bad for some person or another. Either you get the trigger and the opponent facing it's going to feel bad, or you don't get the trigger and you yourself are going to feel bad. So I think that in general, these sorts of triggers that play out characters are bad for the game because they don't actually feel good for anyone playing them, unless, of course, you're the one playing out the triggers every single time and you never miss. Still, like these purple triggers, getting out that one extra character, especially in a deck like Hancock, for example, that can really easily defend them with your leader effect, isn't just one extra attack like it would be in other traditional yellow decks, but end up putting on immense pressure and compounding amounts of damage over the course of the next couple of turns, meaning that the earlier that these triggers come out, the more salient that they're actually going to end up being, meaning that if that first trigger is going to be something like the Gorgon Sisters, then the game may just be over, and that just kind of feels bad for everyone involved. You don't feel like you've really expressed your skill as the Hancock player, and you playing against Hancock don't feel like you ever really got a chance to play the game. And so while I can't speak for the majority of people, this is what I think about triggers. I'm generally fine with late game triggers that can be played around and therefore interacted with in a more unique way. However, I don't like triggers that can come out in the early game and completely run away with the game, depending on which trigger you end up getting. Purple can run away with the game if you get these sorts of Don't Ramp triggers, and yellow can run away with the game if you get one of these trigger characters, especially one of the more powerful ones like Hikonojo or Gorgon Sisters. I don't necessarily think that the answer is to go back to these old triggers that cost one card to play out, either because the power level in the entire game has risen to a point where those sorts of cards just wouldn't cut anymore, unless those effects were extremely powerful to the point to justify trashing essentially 2 cards to play them out. However, again, that plays into the same sort of issue where if you trigger out this crazy card that costs extra to play out, then you get a massive advantage, and if you don't, then you're at a significant disadvantage. So I think that triggers should exist within the game, and that in general they are fairly well balanced, but I feel like if you introduce trigger characters, especially decks that sort of revolve around these trigger characters, you need to make sure that they can actually fight on their own 2 feet and not have too many trigger characters to make them overly reliant on the fact. In a perfect world, personally, I wish that these trigger characters just didn't exist and yellow as a whole was just stronger as a color to not have to rely on these triggers, but we're at a point where these trigger characters are just getting stronger and stronger, so I thought I would just put out my 2 cents. Thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this one. Share it with someone who may enjoy this as well, maybe someone who's talking too much about yellow and how it should be banned entirely as a color. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.